With that, it's a pleasure to introduce Dr. Burman, who will be joining us for also TED Talk style of presentation. So Mary, thanks for being here.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. So I'm calling my talk, which is supposed to be about politics and healthcare, Gobsmacked and how we get to e pluribus unum again. And I put up just a variety of images. I don't know if you're like me. I did feel like this year gobsmacked me in a way I was not prepared for. It just felt like we got way more walloped than we deserved in one year. And I think what that's led to is a divide. The divide was there before, but it's worsened a divide that is huge. And I think our challenge over the coming months is to think how we get back to our motto as a country, which is e pluribus unum, which is not going to be easy, but I think is something that we can do. Now, I have to tell you that I retired this spring, which was a wonderful thing to do, and I've totally enjoyed it. And with all that was happening as a retired academic, what do? We go and read books. And I didn't put these up here to brag about my reading. I put it up here to give you a sense of the sort of wild nature of stuff that I read this spring, convinced at some point that when I'd find the book or an article or a podcast or a webinar or something that would answer these questions of what does all of this mean? What does 2020 mean for me as an individual? What do I need to do in response to it? And what do we as a collective, as a country, need to do in response to such a wild year? I want to start briefly, though, with Robert Putnam's book. If you have not read it, I would urge you to do so. It's a fascinating read. He goes back and looks over about 125 years of US history, starting in the Gilded Age. And in the late 1800s, if you think back upon it, this is the age of the Vanderbilts and others, the railroad barons. We were a deeply divided country at that time. And interestingly enough, Putnam really draws a tight parallel between the late 1800s and now, with the same kind of problems, the same huge divides. He cites a lot of data. If you're into graphs, you'll love the book. But I pulled out two that I thought were interesting. His thesis is that, again, that in the Gilded Age, in the late 1800s, we are as divided, we were divided then as much as we are divided now. And he plots a number of different things. I just chose two that intrigued me. This one on the left side of the screen is concentration of wealth. And as the graph goes up, there's less concentration of wealth. As it goes down, there's more concentration of wealth. And you'll see that in the early 1900s, there was a significant concentration of wealth in the country. But as we approached the 40s, 50s, and 60s, World War II, the Depression, 1960s, wealth was much less concentrated. There was much less of a disparity between the rich and the poor. But since the 1960s, which he argues is a very pivotal time in our country, we dropped off significantly, and we're back now again with concentration of wealth, substantially so. This other graph on the right perhaps fascinates me even more. This is cross-party collaboration, voting in Congress. And again, as the graph goes up, there's more cross-party collaboration, and as the graph goes down, there's less. And again, you see the exact same pattern, interestingly enough, that in the late 1800s, there was not a lot of cross-collaboration, a lot of what would be partisanship. But through the progressive era into the 20s, and again, thinking about Depression and World War II, there was much, much more cross-collaboration. So you would see votes come through Congress that were bipartisan, support by both parties for those kind of votes. But as we clearly know, that has changed dramatically. And you look down at the bottom here in the Obama and the Trump administrations, we are deeply divided. The ACA is a good example of that, where it was primarily just Democrats who voted for that. So we're back. His argument is that we are back. We made this great stride in the 20s, 30s, 40s into the 60s to become a much less polarized country, but we have returned to a very polarized state of time. And we have ended up here, as this cartoon shows us, pulling poor Uncle Sam apart from the left and the right in a very divided way. Now, that's not really who our long-term tradition really is in our country. Those of you who know about DeTocqueville, he was a French man in I think the 1830s that came to the United States, toured the country, and really became inspired by what he saw in our country. This is a quote from Putnam's book. Keenly aware of the dangers of individualism, a term that he had actually coined, Tocqueville was inspired by what he saw in America. Its citizens were profoundly protective of their independence, but through associating widely and deeply, they were able to overcome selfish desires, engage in collective problem solving, and work together to build a vibrant, and by comparison to Europe, at least at that time, surprisingly egalitarian society by pursuing what he called self-interest rightly understood. And we'll talk a bit more about that. And I put these two images up here because I think they highlight that. We are a country that feels people need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. We are individuals, we're rugged sort of individuals. And yet we're also very willing when someone's barn burns down to come together to rebuild that barn for them, to come together in association. And Tocqueville really argues this is the sort of quintessential essence of the United States, this ability to take both individual and collective notions and combine them in a meaningful way through democracy. But I want to step back because that's all pretty abstract and broad. And I want to, partly because Mandy told me I had to talk about politics and healthcare, I thought I'd better pull healthcare in on this one. I want to talk briefly about public health, because public health during this pandemic has become really a lightning rod around individual versus collective rights, which is what we're talking about. Public health is both a philosophy and framework about practice, but also a public institution. As a philosophy, public health differently than a hospital. So if I'm a hospital, I take care of you when you've been in a car accident and you've broken your leg, and as the hospital, I take care of you to restore you back to health again. And it's focused on you as an individual and the problem that you've encountered. But in public health, we've stepped back, and the role of public health is to not look necessarily at the individual. The role of public health is to look at the population and to ensure the population's health, and to do it not after something happens, but in a preventive mode, to prevent a problem from happening in the beginning. Now, unfortunately, public health is little understood in our country. It's invisible to most of us. We don't often even know that it exists. It has a long history. Public health goes way, way back. It has some amazing accomplishments. One of them that I think is important to highlight, the CDC, which has been rightfully criticized during this pandemic, was instrumental in the eradication of smallpox from our world, which is an unbelievable accomplishment. But through the pandemic, public health really has been taking a lot of hits, some justified and some not justified. Clearly, the rollout of testing at the beginning by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention was flawed and deeply impacted how we responded to the pandemic. Now, as an institution, public health has both federal, state, and local levels of it in the United States. But what is absolutely fundamental for you to recognize is that the real business and power of public health comes at the state level. This fits with our federalist model of government. The state has what are called police powers, and we'll come back to that in a couple minutes. The federal government only has indirect authority in terms of public health because there's no notion of public health in the Constitution. So the federal government's ability to impact public health is indirectly through things like interstate commerce, for example. There are also local jurisdictions in terms of public health. In Wyoming, we have frankly a weak public health system at the local level. We have in most of the counties, I think 20 of the 23 counties, a small public health nursing office. They are not full-fledged public health office with an environmental kind of component to them. So and the environmental health piece, which I won't address, is sort of a wacky feature in our state, the way we handle it. But again, fundamentally, the role of public health is at the state level, and all states have a state health department, and that is where the powers of public health lie, not at the federal government level. Now, this picture over on the other side of the screen gives you sort of the core components of what public health does. I'll just highlight one to give an example. So under this notion of assessment, this is where public health role is in surveillance. So when you've probably read about this as we've talked through the pandemic this year, our country has a huge influenza surveillance system. So this surveillance system is ongoing. It's monitoring what's happening across the globe in terms of the flu, monitoring what's happening in the southern half of the hemisphere, which will probably indicate what may be happening up in the northern hemisphere later. This is how we determine what's going to go into the vaccine that will be given out each year. So the federal government, and in collaboration with the states, has this very large surveillance system. And that's a really classic example of what public health does. This is this monitoring and ongoing tracking of disease and what may be coming, so that we can put prevention into place around what may be coming down the pipe in terms of healthcare issues. And I think that part of public health we have no problems with. I suspect if you interviewed people, 99% of people would say, oh, great, that's a wonderful thing, and public health should do that. But what got politicized this year in our many divides, I think, are what are called the police powers. States have, through their public health codes, the ability to enact what are basically referred to as police powers. And these are the things that we saw in our country right now: the quarantining and the social distancing, the isolation, detection, screening kinds of things, contact tracing, vaccination, banning public gatherings, closure of businesses and schools. These are all legitimate public health measures. But when we think back to this idea of collective versus individual rights, you can see how these smack right up against those notions. Because if I if I quarantine you, for example, as a public health official, I have just profoundly influenced your individual rights. I have hopefully then protected the community, the public, but I have smacked right up against your individual rights. And I think these became very, very politicized this year, unfortunately. But this goes back. This is a brief clipping from, I think, the New York Times from the 1918 pandemic. We were arguing about these things way back then as well. These are very old public health measures. Quarantining goes way, way back. Even before we understood germ theory, we pretty figured out when you brought a ship into harbor, lots of nasty stuff came off the ship and people got sick. And if you made people stay on that ship for 40 days, which is where quarantine comes from, you stop that from happening. So these are very old measures. But again, they're easy to become uncomfortable with because of this, again, bumping up against individual rights versus collective rights. And they truly did get, I think, politicized this year, unfortunately. But to reassure you, because I think there's been doubt about this, states codify these rights within their public health codes. This is from the Wyoming Public Health and Safety Statute for the state of Wyoming. And if you just look down here, this is the outline of public health police powers that a state has. In Wyoming, there is the public health state health officer, has the ability to control and the causes of pandemics, epidemics, and so forth. Establish, maintain, enforce isolation and quarantining, close theaters, schools, public places, forbid gatherings of people when necessary to protect the public health. So there's a statutory base to public health and the public health powers that they possess. There's also a significant body of case law as well. This is the most famous public health case that supports the ability for a state to intervene in terms of health matters. It's a case from the early 1900s called Massachusetts versus Jacobsen. This Reverend Henning, a Swedish immigrant, refused in Massachusetts during a smallpox outbreak to take a mandatory vaccination, nor was he willing to pay the fine. So the case made its way up through all the courts to the US Supreme Court. And in 1905, the Supreme Court ruled and said, this is Justice Harlan, Supreme Court Justice Harlan said, all rights are subject to such reasonable conditions essential to the safety, health, good order, and morals of the community. Even liberty itself, the greatest of all rights, is not unrestricted license to act according to one's own will. Again, reinforcing this notion that there is something about collective rights and that a state is obligated to protect those as well. Now, this was not given free license then to health officers to just wake up one morning and say, you know, I really don't like what's happening here and I'm going to stop it. There has to be a public health necessity. I would argue that the coronavirus meets that. It is a clear threat to our community. The death rates are mortifying at this particular point in time. There has to be a reasonable means to intervening and stopping the having an intervention that can stop the negative public health outcome. And that is the case. We do know there has been massive dispute about this, but we do know that social distancing, we know that masking do make a difference and can slow the pandemic down. It has to be proportional. You would never quarantine someone for the common cold. That's completely out of proportion to the impact that the common cold has on public health. So it needs to be proportional. And then it has to avoid harm. And this is a tough one in the case of COVID-19, I think, because it's clear that, yes, we have a reasonable means to slow the pandemic through things like masking and isolation. But we also know that comes with a fairly high price in terms of things like violence and abuse. And that balancing the benefit with a risk like that is always challenging, and it's clearly challenging in the case of COVID-19. So I want you to keep that example of public health in your head as we go forth, because I'm going to go back to sort of an abstract level again. Public health, again, it just exemplifies this tension in our country around individual versus collective rights, and was very much, I think, politicized during the pandemic. So how do we bridge? If we are so divided as a country, how do we go forth? And I think there are things that we can do at an individual level, and I'll talk about a few strategies I've been trying myself to see if I could be a positive factor in all this. And then I think things that we can do together as a collective, again, highlighting that notion of individual versus community. So these are very simple, but they're sort of cognitive strategies I've been using to help me. These are tough times. One of the things I've been doing is just keeping the word e pluribus unum in my head. And when I start to go down the rabbit hole and get really fired up about how on earth could anyone believe what they're believing, what I'm reading in the paper or something, I make myself stop and remember e pluribus unum, out of many one. And I think it's important for us all individually at this point to use some cognitive strategies like this, stop ourselves from that sort of going down the rabbit hole and thinking nobody is even an intelligent person anymore. The second one comes from a book by Arthur Brooks, a conservative writer who wrote a book about Love Your Enemies, which again is an interesting book and you may find helpful to read. His argument is that we have gotten to the point, it's not so much that we're disagreeing with each other, it's that we've gotten to the point that we have a lot of contempt for each other. We just are sure that the other part of the other side of the divide is just a foul individual or something. And I'm a nurse and I come out of a long-term caring tradition, and it's difficult for me to confess this, but I have had this look a number of times on my face, sadly. It's easy to fall into this trap of contempt, and I think we really have to be wary of this and try as much as we can to say no to contempt in our own self. Now, I want to be clear, because I think I'm not being Pollyannish about this. There are things we do need to condemn, and I think that's different than stopping the contempt. The white supremacy, carrying the Confederate flag into our US Capitol on Wednesday are clearly things that we need to condemn as a country. So this is not about that. There are things that are beyond the bounds, but in general course of life, I think we need to say no to contempt and stop that feeling in ourselves about those on the other side of the divide. And Arthur Brooks has some other strategies. Stand up to the man, basically don't get yourself manipulated, escape the bubble, disagree better. We do need competition of ideas, and then to really tune out unproductive discussions. He talks quite a bit about social media, for example, and how to manage that in better ways. The other, I sort of stumbled upon this TED Talk the other day by a guy named Matt Trombley, which you might also find interesting. He's an evangelical Christian, and he talks about his struggle as a man who has deep and significant beliefs about sensitive issues in our country, something like abortion, and yet lives in a very pluralistic world with neighbors who believe very differently than he, and comes from a tradition, obviously, of you need to love your neighbor. And it's his own sort of journey of how he's come to handle that for himself in a way that he finds appropriate. And he emphasizes grace. And I would say the same thing for all of us. Let's be graceful to ourselves and to each other. We're going to say the wrong thing. We are going to at times do things that potentially deepen that divide, at least in the short term. And we need to be forgiving of ourselves and each other. And again, within the pale of normal kinds of things, not the things that go beyond the pale. And then I think the other thing that we really need to do at an individual basis for all of us is get out of the fake news cycle. There is bad news out there, of course there is, and there's news that's not particularly good, but there is news that is good and can inform us in meaningful ways. And we need to recognize that and go back to it. I will be honest with you, I do not watch Fox News, but nor do I watch MSNBC either. Those news media come with specific ideological biases, and we know that ahead of time. I go for the center stuff. I'll highlight PBS NewsHour. We refer to Judy Woodruff as Grandma Judy. She's sort of the Walter Cronkite right now. We need somebody like that. And how can you not trust Judy Woodruff on the news? PBS goes out of its way to present both sides of the argument, not in a CNN free-for-all sort of approach, which I despise, but in a very respectful way. If there's an issue coming forth on, say, immigration, they will bring somebody who was an immigration official in the Obama administration and somebody who was in the Bush administration. And their job is to clearly articulate the differences in perspective. And so we need to go back that there are truly facts. There are not alternate facts. There are facts. And that we do have reputable news sources that will give those to you. They are human institutions. They will make mistakes, but they will give you good news. And I think fair, objective news that we all need at this particular point in time. Now, at a collective level, those are some individual strategies I think we can talk about in terms of the divide. But at a collective, I think we need to stop some narratives that are out there. I think we've created a false dichotomy during the pandemic. When you think about it, we got ourselves sadly into the bind of thinking you either shut down the economy or you didn't. And that dichotomy is not true. And we have discovered that. If you look at schools in Wyoming, we've been able to successfully this fall, challenging. I'm not a teacher anymore. And I can't imagine what it's been like for the public school teachers and the principals and so forth, the other staff. But we've been able to keep those schools open. So we got ourselves into this thinking that there is just either or. We're either or for individual rights or we're for community rights. And I think that's the wrong way to look at this. And we need to step back from that and realize that they are not a dichotomy. They are complementary to each other. And if you go back again to DeTocqueville, we actually need both of them for our society to be successful. I sort of stumbled upon Jonathan Sacks, who turns out to be a Jewish rabbi and a philosopher. It was a fascinating book to read on morality. He makes an interesting argument based on a lot of philosophical kinds of works that what makes, if this fits with DeTocqueville's argument, what makes the United States so unique is that we do have this strong focus on individuals, but we combine it with a state. We do have a government, and that's an important part of our society. But we have something else, and again, DeTocqueville talked eloquently about this. We have what's called civil society. That ability for of us to get together collectively, to associate, to move towards good. And he argues that all three of these are so important within our society. The focus on civil society and state counters unfettered self-interest. Individuals in civil society then counter too much state control. And then individuals and states sort of counter and balance pressures for conformity. If you get too strong in a sort of a community collective focus, think about the 50s, we all had our suburbs, and at 8:15, all the men backed out of the car with their suits on and went to work, and the women stayed home and made supper. That too much conformity can then happen, which is not good, and you lose the individual in it. So Sacks argues that we really need this balance between these three incredible, important components of a society and a democracy. And he clearly says not everything collective is political. Most of it's moral, a matter not of power, but of conscious duty and virtue. And so we need these all together to create that true democracy. The other thing I would say from a collective perspective is that I think we really need to step back. We're asking questions about things like what should be the right size of government. I don't think that's the question we should be asking each other. I think we need to talk about how can we create communities that are resilient, that again incorporate these components of society, the individual, the civil society, and the state, in meaningful ways to have a responsive, effective government, which is a very different question to ask. And there's a growing sort of focus on these community resiliency models because of what's happening. When you think about the climate challenges we're facing, the wildfires this summer, the droughts that we're experiencing in Wyoming, the profound change in our local economies, thinking about coal country, for example, we need to be, again, not focusing so much on the relative size of government, but how to create communities that can do what this definition is. How can we create communities that can respond adequately to hazards, adapt to changing conditions, and withstand and recover rapidly from disruptions? And the authors of this particular model talk about, we argue that this is the reason we need this is because we in the United States have conceptualized health and health of communities predominantly around healthcare. When you think about health, you think about a hospital or a clinic. But our overwhelming investment is in things like drugs and treatment when we've underinvested in the fundamental conditions that keep people healthy, including things like public health. So these community resiliency frameworks are interesting. They're cross-sector models. This isn't something that says the government should do this. It's about how local governments, state governments partner with business, partner with nonprofits, partner with educational systems to really develop these sort of 4 areas. A responsive government, we need that, a responsible government. We need a quality of life, access to employment, education. We need a prepared system, and this is where public health comes into this, that risk reduction surveillance systems that are in place within a community that alert us to when there may be a problem coming. And obviously, this resonates with us in Wyoming, particularly in parts of the state where the economy is drastically changing. We need a strong economy. And again, I want to emphasize that public health is a core part of this. This is one of those public goods, a part of that common good that we really need if we're going to be healthy communities. So I think looking at these frameworks in Wyoming will be very helpful to us. So the last thing I want to do before I open it up is I want to tell a story. One of the things I've been reading about as we talk about dialogue in our country now to think about these divides is to use storytelling as a way to help us get at our values. I just put a brief graphic down there of sort of some core liberal versus conservative values. We focus so much on whether you think, are you in favor of a minimum wage or something like that, when maybe it's better to pull back and find the areas where we share values and can come together. And storytelling can be a different way to do that. That's less potentially confrontational, sort of in your face. So let me tell you a quick story. This is going to pull us back to public health. A number of years ago, 10, 15 years ago, my nephew married a woman from Tunisia, a wonderful Arab Islamic North African, wonderful woman. They had the wedding in Tunisia. A bunch of us went. We were the foreigners, not in a negative way, just a positive way. We drove around in a big tourist bus all over Tunisia, having a blast. It was about a 5 or 6 day wedding. We paraded the first night through Qisar Hilal, the village where her family is from, with pulling along a black steer with a green ribbon around its neck, carrying bags of hummus and couscous and henna. We went to the baths one night and got ourselves whipped by this woman who came and I don't know what she was getting rid of the impurities or something, and whopped us on the back. And we butchered the steer one night and had it for dinner at a humongous, lovely dinner out in an open area. We ended the week tearing the shirt off my nephew, symbolizing his move from a new life, his old life as a single man to a married man. And we ended up at the Mona Lisa Hall in Qisar Hilal with the loudest Lebanese band I'd ever heard in my life, with all the foreigners sticking toilet paper in their ears to try and protect them from the loud noises. It was a wonderful, wonderful cultural exchange and a delightful week. But that's not the real heart of my story. Of the foreigners, those of us that came from the United States and Europe to the wedding, of my family, there were probably 18 or 20 of us there from my immediate family. Almost every one of us got sick during that trip. We were there for 2 weeks. I think my daughter may have been the only one who did not get some diarrhea disease during that time period. We were cautious. We drank clean water. We avoided the things on the menus that were not cooked. But we all ended up getting sick. Now, Tunisia is a developing country. It doesn't have the public infrastructure that we would have in our country. If you think about it, it's going to go back on sort of an individual model. It's up to an individual employer or an individual to safeguard those who may be eating in their restaurant. So if you're a person around individual rights, this model would potentially make sense to you, but clearly has ramifications for us as a public. But let's take it back to the United States. Let's think pre-COVID-19. You wake up on a Saturday morning and you say, you know, I don't really want to cook today. I'm going to go down to 17th Street Cafe and have them cook me a big omelet. I don't stop when I do that and think, ooh, I wonder if I should do that. If I get sick, will I be able to go to work tomorrow? Or will I be able to get my children to their soccer game? I don't think that. I go and have an absolutely wonderful time eating an omelet at the 17th Street Cafe. Now, of course, obviously, we have a developed public health infrastructure in our state, and that infrastructure is around food preparation, food distribution, food worker safety within that. We have a lot of regulations about that. You can't put your thawing meat over a tray of lettuce below it in a cooler, for example, where that meat could drip onto the lettuce and contaminate it. So we have clearly constrained individual and employer rights in that process. But we say we do that for the sake of the public and for the fact that then I can go down and eat breakfast when I want to without worrying. Now, you could argue again that that whole messy nature underlying all this, the individual versus the collective, we've got to side with it. We've got to figure out, do we want to go to the individual or the collective? And I would, as I said earlier, argue that that's a false dichotomy. We don't need to. But by allowing that sort of ugly mess under there, the democracy, this individuals butting up against collective rights, we actually create a system in which we provide, and dare I say, some liberty and freedom within it. That messy democracy allows me the freedom to get up on a Saturday morning and say, you know, I don't want to cook today. I'm going to go get an omelet at the 17th Street Cafe. And I tell that story because I think that's the kind of stories we need to think about telling. Again, they can help elucidate our values, but they also can help us think differently about things. They can help us recognize in this, I think, hopefully in this particular story, that mess of democracy around individual and collective rights is a good mess to have. And that if we think about it differently, it's not a conflict. Yeah, it's messy. It's not a conflict, though. And it actually does allow us to be the country that we are, that does allow us to have individual rights, to have liberty, freedom, and yet also go on to be a powerful country that comes together in association as well. So I would encourage, I know this is part of Leadership Wyoming, it certainly was when I was in it back in 2013, but I encourage all of you to begin to dialogue and tell your stories that help us make sense of this gobsmacked year and help us think back about how we can get to e pluribus unum again.
The Leading in Wyoming podcast is brought to you by the Wyoming Community Foundation and the Jacobsen Foundation. Thank you for your support.